Oh, now we really have to watch what we say. All right. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out to today's speaker series. Just a couple housekeeping things. If you parked in the parking deck, make sure that you get a validation pass. You can see the young lady at the front desk, and she will give you a validation pass so you don't have to pay for parking. If anybody needs to use the restrooms, they are down the hall and around the front desk. So it's a little hike, but not too bad. And without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Amanda Marr. She is a clinical assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry, and her interests include extraordinary cognitive aging and cognitive resilience, the neuropsychology of neurodegenerative disease, and the prediction of cognitive decline and dementia syndromes via performance changes and activities of daily living. Let's give a hand for Dr. Marr.
You all right? All right, good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay? We have a microphone if needed, but we'll try to avoid it. Let me know. Raise your hand if you can't hear, okay? So thanks, Stephanie, for that wonderful introduction. I'm really excited to be here today to talk to you about a topic that I find fascinating, which is super aging. And we'll get into a little bit more about what that is in just a minute. There we go. So first, a little about me and who is paying me before we dive in. I am a neuropsychologist, which means I evaluate and study thinking and memory skills. And I do this both in the clinic at Michigan Medicine and through various research studies at the university as well, some of which are being featured at the back table. So if you have questions or are interested, feel free to hop back there at the end of the talk. The research that we're doing is funded by the National Institute of Health and the Michigan Alzheimer's Disease Research Center. A brief roadmap for what I'm hoping that we can cover today. So first is a bit of history. Sorry, we got to get a little history lesson in there on the history of age and cognition, kind of how we've thought about this over the years. Next, I want to dive into who are superagers. So what is this term? What does it mean? We'll spend the bulk of today talking about what superagers have taught us, what we've learned over the last 15 or so years of studying superagers, and finally talk a little bit about the state of the superaging study, which is currently the superaging research initiative that we're really excited about. All right, so topic one for today, your history lesson. So the early 20th century, scientists and clinicians really thought that significant cognitive impairment was an inevitable part of getting older. All right, so if you take a look at the graphs here, and we'll see if these pointers are working okay. Can you all see this here? So we have memory and cognition over here on the left, age on the bottom, better memory, better cognition on the top of the graph, older age as you go to the right. Okay. Very broadly, cognition declined. This was the thought, cognition declined rather rapidly with increasing age. They declined so much, in fact, that daily activities were thought to just be impaired. You wouldn't be able to manage your bills, manage your finances, drive a car, take your medications. Okay, we call this functional impairment, and that's going to be the dotted line right there. So this was the thinking. You got older, your cognition became impaired. Later, in the 20th century, the idea emerged that maybe such a dramatic decline in our thinking skills, such that they impaired daily activities, was more of a disease state. This disease state we now call dementia. Okay, so our cognition becomes so impaired, we're following the red line, that it impairs daily activities. This is not normal, this is dementia. And perhaps a more gradual, subtle decline in cognitive function following the blue line here was perhaps what was considered to be normal. Today, things get much messier, and researchers believe that there are many different trajectories of cognitive aging, everything from what we consider to be normal on one end of the spectrum all the way through to severe cognitive impairment these red lines, the dementia. This is by no means a scientific graph and perhaps actually shows the limits of my artistic skills. But the dementia lines here are the ones that go below the functional impairment. The blue lines are perhaps our trajectories of what we would consider to be normal cognitive aging. And this new idea, mild cognitive impairment, a term I'm sure many of you have heard, these orange lines, where we see a more significant decline in thinking skills, but not so much that it interferes with our activities of daily living. And folks can stay in this mild cognitive impairment stage for many years. So if we can zoom in and focus now just on this blue cognitively normal line, and again, this is not a scientific graph here, but a hypothetical depiction of what cognitive aging might look like. Well, the average cognitive performance across a population decreases as age increases. We're going to see here that there's a lot more variability that comes in as we age. So each dot here, each blue dot, represents a hypothetical person. At younger ages, on the left side of the graph over here, oops, what did I do, Stephanie? I fixed it. All right. I also have limited tech skills, so here we are. All right, so over here on the left side of the graph at younger ages, you'll see that this is not very wide. There's not a lot of variability in performance when we think about normal performance at younger ages. Everyone's kind of following that average line much more closely. With age, so as we move further to the right, you'll see that this band gets wider. There's more variability in what we would consider to be normal performance. So as age increases, so does the variability in our cognitive skills of what we might consider to be normal. So that some folks, and you can see the folks up here, are sort of maintaining what we would consider to be normal performance for younger folks. But you do see that the bottom part of this normal trajectory is much lower than what we might expect for younger folks. In particular, I'd like you to focus up here on the top right. Right? These folks seem to be doing just about as well as the individuals who are much younger. The question is, are these folks resisting age-related changes, right? Are they somehow not falling victim to what we consider to be age-related cognitive decline? And if so, does this mean that cognitive decline is not an inevitable part of the aging process? This is the question that really prompted the SuperAging study. And it began at Northwestern University in Chicago, like I said, about 15 years ago. And this is the group we're going to spend the bulk of our time talking about today, what we found over the last 10 or 15 years and what's prompted this new study. So, who are superagers? Superagers are specifically defined as adults who are age 80 and older who have a certain level of performance on thinking and memory tests. First question, why age 80? Did we pick it out of a hat? No. Age 80 is one of the big risk factors for dementia and cognitive decline. So when we think about Alzheimer's dementia, people who are age 80 and older are at much higher risk. So age 80 was picked to kind of be the foil to that. They also have very specific thinking and memory test performance. And there are many different types of thinking skills. So before I talk about what the specifics are for superaging, we'll do a quick review of the 5 main types of thinking skills listed here, just so we can better understand what it is we're talking about when we're talking about superagers. And as a warning, I hope you've had some coffee because I may ask you to put your brains to work at the end of this so that we can see all these things in action, all right? So the first thing here, memory. Memory is what allows us to store information away in our brain so that we can retrieve it later. There are many different types of memory. Remembering how to make a special recipe, riding a bike, recalling a friend's telephone number, or even remembering how a friend or family member made you feel. Right? Those are all different types of memory. Processing speed down at the bottom. This is how quickly your brain is able to take in information from the environment and do something with it. So if I were to ask you to count from 1 to 20 as quickly as you can, right? We're getting a measure of your processing speed, how quickly your brain is functioning. Executive functioning. This is really referring to these higher order thinking skills. Things like problem solving, judgment. You can kind of think of this being the executive part of your brain, the CEO that's controlling how you go through your day-to-day tasks. Visual spatial skills. Your eyes take in information from the environment, what color something is, how far away an object is, but your brain has to do something with that information. So for example, I see a yellow blob in front of me. My brain is what tells me, aha, that's a chair. I have to navigate around it. All right. And finally, language skills. The ability to express yourself, to understand what other people are saying to you, and therefore you need to know what words mean, be able to pull the right word to the front of your mind when you need it, and so on. Okay. What does this look like in real life? Okay. So first, I'd like us all allowed to read the words that are printed up here as quickly as we can. Ready? Orange, blue, green, pink, orange, purple, pink. They're good at this. Okay. Now, I wouldn't be a good neuropsychologist if I let you off that easy, so we're going to make things a little more complicated. All right. So the next thing that I'm going to ask you to do, again, as quickly as you can, is to try to say the color of the font. Not what the word itself says, but the color that it's printed in. Ready? Go ahead. Pink, green, blue, gray, white, red, gray. It's all right. Good job, everyone. All right, so the second task is much harder, and it likely took your brain much longer to do. Your brain is being asked to do multiple things at the same time. The first and the biggest one is your brain is trying to prevent you from doing what it's been trained to do since elementary school, which is read the word you see. So you need to use that executive functioning skills to inhibit your response and do what we've asked you to do, which was to read the color of the font. Of course, we're putting your visual spatial skills to work. You need to identify the color. We're putting your language skills to work. You're saying the words. We're putting your processing speed to work. We asked you to do this as quickly as you could. And of course, you had to remember the directions, remember what I asked you to do. Right? So this is a pretty challenging task. But good job. Yes, sir. Yes. Absolutely. Absolutely. Very good. And that's where your executive functioning skills are coming in your brain. All right. So back to superaging. We said that superagers are defined by very specific thinking and memory performance on these tests. In particular, we're looking at folks who have really extraordinary memory performance. So if you think back to the graphs I showed you just a moment ago, we saw that typically we think about memory and cognition as having at least a slow decline with age. But those people in the top right looked like they had similar performance as people much younger than they are. And that is how we are defining superagers. Individuals whose memory performance is just as good as the average 50 to 65-year-old adult. So this level of performance, when we take a look at sort of these broad population norms, is better than about 94% of their same age peers. So they're doing really, really well. Why memory? Memory is the area of thinking that is most complained about by folks when they get older. I walk into a room, I can't remember why. Where did I put my glasses, right? Did I remember the conversation I had with my daughter yesterday? So we're specifically taking a look at memory because that's what people are concerned about. It's also, historically, the defining feature of Alzheimer's dementia, right? So the type of dementia where your memory becomes so impaired, you really have a lot of trouble remembering things. In terms of other cognitive areas, so processing speed, language skills, executive functioning skills, we're simply asking that folks are at least average for age. So we're not putting a superior level of functioning across cognitive tasks. The idea being some folks may have really amazing cognitive performance across thinking domains, but perhaps people have really good memory, and we can understand why that is without having this global superior cognitive profile. Finally, for the SuperAging study, we were looking at people who had relatively stable general health. So what do I mean by that? We certainly were not excluding people who had heart disease, diabetes, and so on. We just asked that those conditions were relatively well controlled at the time they joined the study. That way, when we're looking at people over time, right, they come into the study, their diabetes is controlled. We know that uncontrolled heart conditions can contribute to some cognitive fluctuations. So we were trying to take that into account. All right. These are some pictures of actual superagers from our Northwestern cohort. They're really quite a remarkable group. And they're a pretty rare phenotype. They're very hard to find. I believe it's about 20% of people who call us saying, you know, I think I have really good memory for my age. About 20% are actually qualifying for the SuperAging study, which is fun. Despite this, over the last 10 or 15 years, we have 289 people who have enrolled. Most of them are in the Chicagoland area, although over the last year, as we'll talk about at the end, the study has gone on to 5 sites across North America, one of them being here at U of M, which we're really excited about. More than half of the sample is female, so 68% about at this time. And there's a pretty broad age range when they come in for their first study visit, with the youngest being about 80, and the oldest individual who joined was 104, which is rather remarkable. The oldest superager in the study right now, I believe, is 106. And she's still doing remarkably well. A question that typically comes up really early on, again, are these superagers really just a collection of these NASA astrophysicists and Albert Einstein types who have gone to 10,000 years of school and are just doing really, really well overall from a cognitive perspective? And the answer to this question is no, and we'll get into that a little bit more in a moment, but we can even just take a look at it from a formal education perspective. There are folks who completed the 6th grade, and that's as far as they went in school in our study. And then there are people who did complete a doctoral degree, so they went all the way through schooling. But it doesn't seem to be that we just have a bunch of really highly educated folks. We did. We'll get into that in a little bit. Thank you for prompting. All right. Oh, you will notice that one thing that I didn't include here was race and ethnicity. I didn't have the complete data at the time that I was putting the slides together. It is about, at this time, and this is an incredible limitation of the study, it's about 85% so far of a white sample. This is not representative, and one of the big pushes of the current SuperAging research initiative is to really focus on bringing in folks who are historically underrepresented in research so that we can balance out the SuperAging cohort to reflect the national sample. Okay. SuperAgers are pretty incredible. Medical science has enabled us to live really long lives, right? People are living until 90, 100, 106. And superagers are showing us evidence that we can all live healthy lives. So we're able to increase that health span along with our medically long lifespan. By studying and understanding what is going right in the brains of these 80-plus-year-olds, we hope to be able to learn how we can promote healthy cognitive aging and prevent Alzheimer's disease. As many of you know, there is the National Alzheimer's Project Act that was passed unanimously by Congress back in 2010 and signed shortly thereafter by President Barack Obama, which is really here to coordinate efforts to study Alzheimer's disease and to come up with an effective treatment for Alzheimer's disease by 2025. As part of this framework, they had a couple of goals. One was to accelerate action to promote healthy cognitive aging and to reduce risk factors for Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. That's one of the goals of this study. The next, again, was to prevent Alzheimer's disease by 2025. One way to do that, study what's going right with the brain so we can use it to help people who are experiencing cognitive decline. This is the woman here who is 106 years old, who is in our study. And really, she's been in this study for many years in Chicago. She's retaining a remarkable level of cognitive performance. And she's showing us that we can redefine our expectations of what is possible in older age. And I think, and perhaps most importantly, this study is helping to reduce the stigma associated with aging. There's still an unfortunate stigma that comes along with it. If we think back to that early 1900s, kind of thinking about age being associated with pretty significant cognitive decline, there's still threads of that are prevalent in our society. And superagers are, again, challenging this notion. This woman here is hanging out with penguins. Okay. What have superagers taught us so far? Really, we have learned quite a bit about this group over the last 15 years. They are very unique phenotype. They have unique biological factors, genetic factors, family history factors, psychosocial factors, and we'll dive into each one. Earlier, I mentioned that a question comes up a lot is, are these superagers, again, these really smart people, they have excellent cognitive performance across domains in every single test they take? And the answer to this question appears to be no. There is a lot of variability outside of memory performance. So early work on a small sample showed that in these non-memory thinking domains, about half of our superaging sample is falling right in the average range for their age. Okay, so their attention is average, their language is average, their executive functioning is average. There's certainly quite a number who are falling in this above average and superior range. There are also a handful who are falling below average for their age. And more recently, we published findings from a much larger sample of superagers, and we directly compared them to their same age peers who had cognitively average memory for their age. And so on this graph here, our superagers are depicted by the blue line, and our average memory older adults are depicted by the orange line. The farther out you go from the center on this graph, the better your cognitive performance. And the closer to the center, the more average your cognitive performance. And the variability in the performance is depicted by the thickness of the line. So you can see up here for the superagers, their memory, really thin line. And you look down here at visual spatial skills, the lines get much thicker. People are a little bit more variable there. What you can see, though, is that our superagers are very clearly outperforming, as we would expect, given that it's our criteria for them, their elderly peers on memory. We're also seeing that they're doing much better in terms of attention and working memory, whereas their language, visual spatial, processing speed, and executive functioning skills are just about the same as their peers. So again, superagers are not superior in all cognitive domains. There appears to be something specific to memory and maybe attention as well when we look at them as a group. Now, you all are a very intelligent group, and perhaps the next question you're asking is, okay, superagers aren't superior across cognitive domains, but did they just have remarkable memory skills in midlife that they were able to experience that age-related cognitive decline? But since they started off so high, they're declining and they're still high. Or did they maintain their level of performance over time? And this was something that we looked at. So our research is suggesting that the vast majority of superagers are maintaining their good level of memory over time. So they're not declining and just started off at a really high baseline, but they're really maintaining their performance. So these graphs here are showing two of our common memory tests that we give. One is a list task. I say a grocery list of words for folks to remember, and they have to repeat it back. And the other one is a short story. If you take a look here, so we have the first visit when they come in. We have the second visit where they come in about a year and a half later. And all the performances that are in the gray box on both sides are representing average levels of performance for people in their 50s and 60s. And as you can see, the vast majority of our superagers are staying in that average range for 50 to 65-year-olds. We do have a couple people on the word list task who did decline a little bit over time, but the vast majority are maintaining their really high level of memory performance over time. And as we've continued to study superagers over the years, we don't have published data on this yet, it's coming up, we continue to see that the majority of them are maintaining their level of memory performance 3 years after they first joined the study, 5 years after they first joined the study, with a little bit of fluctuations, as we all have. The next question people like to ask is, well, are superagers, do they all have a certain personality, or do there certain psychological factors that they all share that contribute to really good memory performance? We used a personality inventory called the NEO that breaks down personality into 5 main factors: neuroticism, extroversion, agreeableness, openness to new experiences, and conscientiousness. And we really didn't find any differences in these self-reported personality measures between our superagers and our elderly controls. However, we fully acknowledge that people coming to participate in a research study might not be representative of the population as a whole. And so we took a look at superagers compared to these more population-based norms. Superagers were higher in terms of extroversion, as you might expect. They're coming to participate in a research study, but that was really all we saw. So there's not really a personality factor that's there. We also looked at these self-reported questionnaires focused on psychological well-being. In particular, we looked at an inventory called the PWB42, the Psychological Well-Being Inventory, with 42 items that looks at measures of autonomy, so how independent of a thinker is somebody, environmental mastery, sort of their sense of control or mastery over their environment, personal growth, where someone might see themselves as kind of being open to new experiences, personally growing in day-to-day life, having positive and warm relationships with other people, feeling like they have a purpose or a goal in life, and finally having a positive attitude towards oneself, sort of that self-acceptance. And of those 6 factors, what we saw was that superagers are endorsing having many more, on a much higher quality, of positive relationships with other people. Anecdotally, and we've done some work here, but it's a little bit more subjective type of work, so data is still forthcoming here. But we've noticed that many superagers have had to overcome pretty significant obstacles in their life. They seem to have this resilience and perseverance. Many of our superagers were single mothers, and not necessarily by choice, during the 1960s, when this wasn't necessarily something that's as widely accepted as it is now. Much more challenging. We did have superagers who were survivors of the Holocaust, survivors of domestic violence. Okay, so these people who have been through an extraordinary amount in their lives and have come out the other side and are really showing this resilience. Another question people ask, are there lifestyle factors that contribute to superaging? For example, are superagers simply a cohort of people who are eating pounds of blueberries every day, exercising, and never drinking alcohol? Not necessarily. In terms of social engagement, perhaps not surprising, given the findings we just mentioned, superagers remain really engaged socially in their communities. As our research assistant who is here today, Gabby, can tell you, it's hard to schedule these folks for research visits, right? Their schedules are jam-packed with volunteering. Some are doing part-time work. We had one who volunteered his time to do taxes for people who needed help. They are organizing events in their community and all sorts of things. I would be absolutely exhausted if I had their schedule. So they're remaining really busy and active. About 80% still exercise and engage actively in their daily life from a physical perspective, but this isn't necessarily marathon running. A lot of people come to our center, they're using canes, walkers, and things like that, but they're still able to find ways to move their body, get their blood moving on a daily basis. And the vast majority of superagers are indeed achieving recommended physical activity levels that are put out by the government. In contrast, they are not doing so well on their sleep. On average, superagers are still not meeting recommended sleep duration. So that doesn't necessarily seem to be something for this cohort that is particularly kind of contributing perhaps to their memory performance. And diet, which is not everyone's favorite topic, but as so far, anecdotal evidence is not supporting major differences here between our superagers and our elderly controls. One question that we ask every superager who joins the study is, what do you think contributes to your superaging status? And some people will tell us, absolutely, every day at 5 o'clock for the last 30 years, I have had a martini. And other people will say it's because I exercise 2 hours every day and I never drink, I never smoke. So things are all over the place. Diet is a little bit hard to quantify objectively. As you can imagine, we get a lot of self-report data, so we're still working on ways that we might be able to get a more objective sense there, because I know it's something people have a lot of questions about. Kind of getting into your family history and genetics question, are superagers simply at really low risk for developing different types of dementia? And in terms of family history, it's really variable. Some superagers end up in the study because they have relatives, parents, siblings who have dementia, and they want to help understand factors that may prevent it for other folks. Other superagers have this family history that's pretty clean of cognitive impairment, so we're not seeing really too much signal there. Genetics work is still ongoing, but some early data that was published last year is suggesting that genetic risk factors for Alzheimer's dementia, such as the ApoE gene that many of you have heard about, is roughly the same in superagers compared to the general population. So this graph here, a little complicated, but we'll see if we can break it down. So we have our superagers over here in the orange, and our controls over here in the blue. This is a very fancy term that basically just says how much at risk are you for developing Alzheimer's disease. And the higher up you are on the graph, the more your risk. The lower down on the graph, the lower your risk. These dark lines here are considered to be the average for the different groups. And these lines here are the distribution of people. So as you can see, not really too many differences here. If anything, our controls might be at slightly lower risk than our superagers, but statistically, not so much of a difference. And this 0 line would be kind of an equivocal, right? Right in the middle. You're not at higher risk compared to the general population. You're not at lower risk. So in summary, the superior memory performance of our superagers not really being explained by genetic or family history factors at the moment. The genetics work is still early. They're doing a lot more work with the current study, and so we hope that we can have some findings for everybody soon. What about the brains of superagers? What do those look like when we take a look under the MRI? Are they different in some way? And so on the left here, we have what might be considered an average younger brain. The bumps, which are called gyri, are really big and plump. There's not a lot of space between them. And on the right, I'm showing you a very exaggerated image of an older brain, okay? You'll see it's not as plump. There's a lot more space between those bumps. This is called atrophy. The brain naturally shrinks a little bit with age. Not to this extent. This is exaggerated just to show you. But this is what happens to everybody's brain. When we compare the brains of middle-aged and elderly controls, so people with normal cognition, at a single time point, we see what we expect to see. Here, everything that's in red and yellow is where the brain is thinner or a little bit smaller in our elderly controls compared to the middle-aged controls. So we're seeing the shrinkage that we would expect to see over time. When we compare the brains of superagers to those same middle-aged controls, you see that those brains are all gray. That's because there is no significant difference in how big or plump the superaging brains are compared to the middle-aged controls. And in fact, if you look really closely, and it's in blue, not the best color, so I've circled it here, there is one area of the brain called the anterior cingulate cortex that is thicker in superagers. So it's bigger in superagers, even compared to the middle-aged controls. So just like when we were talking about memory performance earlier, there are a couple of hypotheses why this might be. Did superagers start with just really enormous brains when they were younger, and so they're still shrinking over time, but they started off bigger, and so therefore their shrinkage is still looking much plumper and more consistent with middle-aged brains? Or are they just not really shrinking as much? Are they not atrophying over time? And we cannot go back in time and look at possibility 1, so we chose to look at possibility 2. And so we started with kind of that 18-month, looking at folks from their baseline visit to their first follow-up visit, because that's where we had a big enough N to start. And we wanted to look at the whole brain volume of both elderly controls and superagers. So over here on this x-axis, we have brain volume. Bigger brain volumes, higher up on the chart. We have our elderly controls over here on the left, our superagers over here on the right. We have their first visit in blue and their follow-up visit about 18 months later here in green. And although it's a little bit challenging to see, the difference here was really small. The difference here was a little bit bigger. I put the percent shrinkage of the brain over about a year in big numbers here on the right. Elderly controls, they were both showing shrinkage, the elderly controls and the superagers, but the elderly controls are shrinking at about twice the rate of the superaging brains. Okay, so they're shrinking a little bit faster. When we take a look at the brains under the microscope, people wonder, do they just have brains that are free of Alzheimer's pathology? And brain donation is a very optional part of the SuperAging study, but it's been a really valuable one, and we're very appreciative of the folks who have given this generous research gift. SuperAgers tend to have less Alzheimer's pathology in their brains. So when we think of Alzheimer's pathology, we think of those neurofibrillary tangles, and we think of the amyloid plaques. When we take a look at the tangles, we have the amount is over here on the y-axis. So more is worse. You want fewer. We have our controls here in kind of this orangish red and the superagers here in this bluish green color. You can see very clearly the superagers have fewer tangles in their brain. This is not really the case with the amyloid plaque, okay, where their two groups are about the same. But from a tangle perspective, much less in our superagers. If we think back for a minute to the area of the brain, the anterior cingulate cortex, that was much thicker in superagers compared to the middle-aged controls, researchers really wanted to dive into that area to see whether there was something there that may contribute to superagers' really good memory performance. And when they took a look under the microscope of superager brains compared to their same age peers with normal memory and the middle-aged controls, they found that superagers had many more, a much higher density of this special type of brain cell called a von Economo neuron. These are really big neurons. We don't know a ton about them, but they are found in higher order species, males, great apes, humans. And the hypothesis is that they have something to do with social cognition. Thinking back to the psychosocial functioning, superagers are endorsing having many more positive, high-quality relationships with other people. Okay, so even though these connections are purely speculative at this point, we're starting to wonder, is there something here? Is there some signal here? So that was a summary of the amazing things we have learned thus far from our superagers. They are a really unique group. They have important biological, physiological, cognitive, and psychosocial factors that seem to be unique to them compared to their peers. Hopefully, I've convinced you a little bit that studying this unique group is telling us that cognitive decline with age is not necessarily inevitable, and there may be some specific factors that are contributing to it. We found almost 300 of these people in the Chicagoland area, and now the goal is to expand this research across the nation. Ultimately, we're going to make it an international study so we can learn how to improve our cognitive health span in addition to our increasing lifespan. Okay, this brings us to the new study, the SuperAging Research Initiative. Last year, the study of superagers expanded nationally and internationally up to Canada. Here at U of M, we are thrilled to be one of the 5 sites that are studying superagers. The primary goal of the superaging study is to increase the size of the cohort. We're hoping to add about 500 new people with a little bit more geographic diversity. I imagine that the city-dwelling folks in Chicago, again, are not necessarily representative of the rest of the country. Second, you may remember when we spoke in the beginning, about 85% of the superaging sample at this point is white. That's no good. So the second goal is to really increase racial and ethnic diversity. And here at U of M, being so close to Detroit, we're specifically focusing on Black African-American individuals so that we can contribute and help make this research more representative of the nation as a whole. Finally, by increasing the size of the sample, we are hoping to be able to ask new questions and perhaps in new ways. Things we often ask about on self-report, as we've talked about, can be harder to quantify. And there's some really cool new things that we're doing that perhaps will give us some answers to the questions like diet, get into sleep quality a little more, things like that. So here is not an exhaustive list, but kind of an overview of the things that the new study is taking a look at. Our eligibility criteria, I'm just going to list it up here, but basically folks who are over age 80, who are able to complete some thinking and memory tests, who are performing at least average for age in all of their thinking domains and are willing to undergo a blood draw and who are feeling safe to have an MRI. And that's something that we work with participants on to make sure that it is a safe project for them. We are completing a number of things during these visits, a lot of thinking and memory tests, which are paper and pencil, kind of like you're in school. We're asking questions about family medical history, lifestyle, psychological functioning. We're taking a look at the structure of the brain, so taking a good picture of the brain in an MRI. We are sending some folks home who are interested wearing biosensors. So you kind of think of those Apple Watches or those Fitbit watches that track your activity over time. So we have a watch, we have one you wear on your ankle, and a sensor that folks are wearing on their chest. And the chest sensor is particularly cool because it's able to take a look at the function of the heart and the nervous system as folks go about their day-to-day life. It can tell us when people are talking. It can tell us when somebody's heart rate is going through the roof. So, right, the stress is going up. It can tell us when folks are exercising. We can look at movement patterns. It gets good measurements of sleep and any heart difficulties that are happening in day-to-day life. So it's getting a lot of objective data to add to these subjective reports that we've been looking at over the last 10 or so years. Some folks that you often see at our SuperAging visits are listed here, and we have a bunch of new team members, one of whom, Ave, is here today, so we're really thrilled that she's joining us. Thank you for your time, for listening to our talk about these extraordinary individuals, and I think we have plenty of time for questions. Yes, ma'am.
Brain. I've always thought that how big protein.
You can. You can.
Indicate more or less Alzheimer's, they just don't are.
Yep, so you tend to see different profiles for folks, but it can happen where you get a little bit more of one and a little bit less of the other. Yep. Yes. Yep. Great question. So if I'm understanding, can we really improve memory, right? We're saying that cognitive decline isn't inevitable, but kind of what can I do to improve memory over time? Is it changeable? And really what we talk about in the clinic is that we don't necessarily have strategies right now if you're experiencing memory decline that will necessarily bring you back up to where you were. But there are many things that people can do at home to maintain a level of functioning. Some of these things are, just as you said, staying socially active and engaged. You can think of your brain like a muscle. It needs exercise. It needs to be worked on a fairly regular basis. Learning new skills, doing crossword puzzles if you like crossword puzzles, and if you don't, please don't do them. But doing something that you do like Sudoku, reading a book, and then talking about it with a friend, watching a movie and talking about it with a family member. So making these more passive activities active and getting you engaged with the material, thinking about it in a new way is really good. Physical activity, anything that's good for your heart really is good for your brain. Your brain uses tons of oxygen, needs all the blood, and so anything that gets your heart pumping, gets the blood flowing is really good. That can be taking any medications that you have for your heart as prescribed, getting active, whether it's walking, raking leaves, seated yoga, whatever your cup of tea is, and heart healthy diet, right? So focusing on those leafy greens, fruits, nuts, minimizing things like butter, sweets, red meat, to some extent, sugar, yep. All right. Yes, ma'am.
Is study
all done at the Ann Arbor campus, or is it even done in Detroit?
Great question. We are seeing folks both in Ann Arbor and Detroit. The MRI scan is the one thing that we don't have in Detroit that is in Ann Arbor, but all other study activities can happen right here, actually, at the U of M Detroit Center, just across the hall. We do have transportation options available too for folks who need it to get from Detroit to Ann Arbor for that MRI scan. We can have a cab come pick folks up and then drop them back off at their home afterwards. Yes, sir.
Where does the level of sensitivity?
Great question. And that's something we haven't been able to quantify in as objective a manner as we would like at this point. But it kind of speaks to outlook on life, right? Are you somebody who takes things very seriously? Are you somebody who kind of takes everything with a grain of salt? So we add it into our personality factors a little bit, but it's been hard for us to quantify it at a level. Yep. Yeah. We try to get at it in different ways, but yeah, you bring up a really good point. Yep. And that's something we haven't delved into quite as much, but something that certainly would be an area of interest going forward. Yeah. Very good. Yep. So what about companionship? So we try to get at that through these positive social relations. And I talked about it a little bit more broadly. In part, many of our superagers are living alone. And so we talk about kind of, is it family? Is it friends? Who are the people who they are feeling close to? And it's not necessarily the quantity of relationships, but it seems to be the quality and feeling like the people that they do have in their life, they're really close to, that they feel like they can rely on. So we're certainly trying to get at that. Absolutely. Yeah, so the question is married, single, kind of marital status, how does that play in? And so far we haven't found any convincing evidence kind of one way or another, but it certainly is a really interesting area. And it does seem kind of, again, if they have people who they're feeling close to, it doesn't necessarily matter whether it's someone who they're married to right in their home. But again, something that is certainly, as we get these higher numbers across the country, that'll be really wonderful to take a look at. Yes, ma'am.
I always thought that you could retrain the brain, but you're saying once the cognitive decline is begun, that you can maintain by doing the exercise, you don't get back what is lost.
Correct. So the question is, once you start to decline, are you able to get back to what's lost, or can you kind of maintain it? At this point, we tend to think of slowing down, maintaining levels of performance. That seems to be where the research is suggesting. There are different non-pharmaceutical therapies, things like cognitive training, cognitive rehab that some people do. These are often done after an acute brain injury. So you have a major trauma to your head, you have a stroke, and you can do some exercises to regain some function. But when we're talking about this age-related cognitive change, it's more a matter of prevention at this time, maintaining. Does that answer your question? Okay. Other questions? These are great. Boyko. Yes. So the question is, do we have plasma biomarkers for some of these subjects? And so right now, they are analyzing that data at a broad scale because they initially did it just for a small sample. So stay tuned. Yeah. Yeah. Right. So some of our superagers kind of getting at this idea, risk level for Alzheimer's and different dementias. Are superagers all just at really low risk for developing cognitive decline? And the answer seems to be no at a broad level. There are some folks who are are indeed really at low risk for developing cognitive decline, but there are others that seem to be maintaining this really high memory level despite having these risk factors. And so one of the things, Boyko, that we're really interested in kind of figuring out, especially as we increase the size of the cohort, is are there different pathways to getting this really good memory? Are there some people who are at low risk and that is how they maintain good memory? But then what about the people who are at high risk of Alzheimer's? Can we look at them separately and say what's contributing to their ability to not develop disease and to maintain their good memory? So we're thinking there are going to be multiple pathways. We just need more people in order to start diving into that.
I
Yes.
saw a graph that said 1/3 means the same when improve and 1/3 when decline.
Yes.
Is that so true?
So when we think about mild cognitive impairment, so those folks who are having some difficulty with their memory and thinking skills over time, but not so severe that it's negatively affecting their ability to do their day-to-day tasks. We call those people mild cognitive impairment. When someone gets a diagnosis of mild cognitive impairment, you may have heard of it as MCI, there are different trajectories. About a third of those folks will stay relatively stable over time. A third of those folks will improve over time, and a third of those folks tend to go on to develop a dementia syndrome.
So the third that improved, did they do something or medication or those social and exercise?
Great question. Great question. Sometimes it's hard to know. Sometimes when we test people, right? So you come into the clinic, we give you some tests. Maybe you slept really poorly the night before. Maybe you were under a ton of stress from life. Maybe you just freaked out, right? Because these tests are hard, you're feeling nervous. So there's so many different factors that can contribute to a test performance. It's sometimes hard to know what combination of those factors people are coming in with. So it's possible to get a test performance that's low. Maybe you have a medical condition going on, an acute medical condition that's negatively impacting memory. So it's hard to know at a single time point necessarily what's contributing to poor cognitive performance. So it's possible that some of those factors have improved, some of those acute factors. The person slept better, they knew what was coming, so they were less anxious. The acute medical condition resolved, and maybe that's why they were doing better the next visit. Good question. Yes, sir. As opposed to,
Limbic system, lower brain.
got it.
Cerebellum.
It was, and I apologize again, that was a very exaggerated image just so I could get the point across, but yes, that was definitely a disease state brain, not a normal brain. But when we think about brain shrinkage, we tend to focus a lot on our neuroimaging research, at least in the SuperAging cohort, on the outside of the brain, kind of the bark of the brain, the cerebral cortex. Part of that is a limitation of some of the neuroimaging methods that we've been using. We haven't been focusing on the internal structures quite as much. We have focused on the entorhinal cortex, the hippocampus in particular. But other than that, we haven't been taking a look at some of the more internal structures of the brain more specifically yet. Yes. No, I appreciate it.
Okay, doctors are keep talking about the sleep apnea.
Mhm.
Now, where does sleep apnea come in? Particularly the mild cognitive.
Great question. Yeah, so sleep apnea, especially if it's untreated sleep apnea, meaning that someone's not necessarily using a device that would help improve breathing quality at night, can negatively impact cognition. You can think about it. The brain's not getting enough oxygen at night. This is happening every night, right? And so it can negatively impact cognition. By treating the sleep apnea, whether it's with like a CPAP device or whatever else your doctor is recommending, that can be beneficial. Alcohol. That is a complicated question. So there is some research that suggests moderate alcohol use is just fine. That means about 1 drink a day for women, 2 drinks a day for men. Heavy alcohol use is not good for your brain. So having more than that on a regular basis, not good for cognitive efficiency over time. Yes, ma'am. Great question, and that's not something we've taken a look at yet, but definitely one that's a really interesting idea to explore. Really good question. I'll get back to you next year. Thought I saw another one. Oh, yes.
Think I'm gonna go MRI
Yes.
that, and you can judge the neurogenesis process in the brain, whether it's synapse production or neuron production. Seems to be pretty high.
Yeah, so the superagers, the brain structure is remaining really plump over time. It's not shrinking quite as much as their peers. It's still shrinking over time, just not as quickly, for sure. I'm not sure I could answer that question based on the scans that we've done, but it's certainly an interesting one. Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions? All right, Stephanie.
All right, and just a reminder, if you haven't gotten your validation pass, to see the young lady at the front desk, so you can get your validation pass and you won't get charged for parking.